When President Franklin D. Roosevelt called America the great arsenal of democracy, few understood what that truly meant. The words sounded grand, almost poetic, but behind them was a challenge that seemed impossible. In 1940, the United States was not ready for war. Its army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Its factories built cars, refrigerators, and tractors, not tanks, not guns, not bombers, but within just 2 years. That would change not by decree, but by conversion. Detroit, the beating heart of American industry, would be transformed into the front line of the war. Assembly lines once filled with polished Buicks and Packards were stripped bare and rebuilt over night. Welding torches replaced chrome polishers. Engineers traded luxury for logistics. At the center of this transformation stood one monumental project, the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, constructed by the Chrysler Corporation in record time. A facility designed not for elegance or comfort, but for raw, unrelenting output. The plant covered nearly 1 million square feet, a cathedral of steel, rivets, and roaring machinery. Here, tens of thousands of men and women, many who had never held a wrench before, would learn to build the tank that would carry democracy across the battlefields of Europe. The M for Sherman. The Sherman wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most armored or the most heavily armed, but it could be built fast, and fast was everything. As one engineer put it, we weren't trying to build the best tank. We were trying to build enough tanks to win inside those vast factory halls. Efficiency was religion. Each worker performed their motion in rhythm, every bolt and weld part of a living symphony of production. By the end of 1942, the Detroit Arsenal was producing tanks faster than anyone believed possible, one every hour and 45 minutes. But perfection, even in an age of miracles, came at a cost. And sometimes, perfection had to be found, not in design, but in mistake. In the early months of 1943, amidst the noise of clattering steel and shouting foremen, one man's small, unnoticed error would set in motion a change that even the generals in Washington couldn't have predicted. His name was John Miller, a 37-year-old machinist from Toledo, Ohio. He was an ordinary man, quiet, steady, proud of his work. He had never been a soldier, never seen combat. But on a cold morning in February, inside a tank factory on the edge of Detroit, his hands would shape history. John Miller had been working at the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant for just under 6 months. Before the war, he'd been a two-land die maker for a small auto parts company in Toledo. When that factory was converted for war production, he followed the work north, like tens of thousands of others who poured into Detroit from every corner of America. By 1943, the city was alive with industry. Trains thundered day and night, carrying steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Akron, and armor plate from Bethlehem. In the air hung the constant hum of engines, a symphony of America's awakening war machine. Inside the arsenal, Miller worked the night shift. His station was a long-line C-turret assembly. His job was precise, aligning the bearing ring that allowed the turret to rotate smoothly. It was repetitive work, but critical. One misalignment could jam a turret mid-battle. The plant never slept. Under the harsh glare of overhead lights, workers moved like clockwork, their faces hidden beneath sweat and soot. Women in coveralls riveted plates into place. Men hauled chains, guided cranes, shouted above the deafening roar of compressors. Every tank that rolled off the line bore a small tag, built in Detroit, Arsenal of Democracy. It was more than pride. It was identity. John took his job seriously. He was not an engineer, not a foreman, but he understood machinery, the way steel felt when it was cut right, the way a bolt should turn when the fit was true. He had seen how every improvement, every small adjustment, could make the work faster or smoother. So when the line began to fall behind one night, a jammed component, a delay with parts from another section, John made a decision. It was a simple adjustment. The torque setting on one of the turret ring fittings was slightly off, specified at 180 foot-pounds, but Miller tightened it to 200. He did it out of habit more than defiance. The tighter fitting felt right. He didn't tell anyone. The tank moved down the line. By the end of the shift, 10 turrets had been assembled with Miller's extra torque. And then he forgot about it. Another long night. Another shift done. But a week later, during a test at the proving grounds in Chrysler's Chelsea facility, something unusual happened. A crew testing one of those tanks reported that the turret rotation was noticeably smoother, even after the vehicle had been driven for hours over rough terrain. Normally, test crews had to stop and readjust after extended runs due to vibration loosening the fittings. But not this one. It held perfectly. Engineers were puzzled. Nothing in the assembly notes indicated any changes. The tank was logged, tested again and again. The results repeated. It wasn't faster or stronger. It was reliable. And in war, reliability was gold. When word reached the plant, Chrysler's head engineer, William Knudsen, asked for a full inspection of the affected turrets. That's when they discovered the over-torqued fittings. By all technical standards, it was an error. By practical standards, it was a breakthrough. They ran more tests. The tighter fittings reduced wear on the bearing ring by nearly 40%. That meant fewer maintenance hours in the field and fewer broken turrets under fire. Knudsen ordered the new torque setting to become standard procedure. And John Miller, a factory worker who had never finished high school, had just improved the single most crucial moving part of the Sherman tank. He didn't know it at the time. No memo carried his name. The workers didn't talk about it much. But weeks later, production speeds increased, maintenance issues dropped, and field commanders in North Africa began to notice fewer turret malfunctions. A mistake turned innovation, born not from design, but instinct. Spring 1943, in Tunisia, under a white sun and a sky thick with dust, Sherman tanks rumbled through the hills. The U.S. the Second Corps, recovering from early defeats, was learning fast, adapting to the brutal realities of tank warfare. Against the German Panzerivs and Tigers, the Shermans weren't superior, not in armor, not in firepower, but they were reliable. They started when asked, moved when commanded, and most importantly, kept fighting when the battle got rough. That spring, field reports began returning to Washington and Detroit. Turret rotation consistent after 200 miles. No mechanical failures after sustained firing tests. Gunner reports smoother aiming under stress. To most, these were just numbers on paper. But to William Knudsen and his engineering team back in Detroit, they told a different story, a confirmation that their minor production adjustment was making a major difference. Knudsen had been a titan of American industry long before the war, an immigrant turned industrial genius, responsible for organizing much of the U.S. wartime manufacturing miracle. He'd seen innovation come from unlikely places, factory lines, tool sheds, even janitors who understood machines better than engineers on paper. So when his assistant mentioned that the turret issue had been solved by a line worker's deviation, Knudsen didn't dismiss it. He ordered a full review. The investigation traced back to Line C, night shift. One worker's torque wrench had been calibrated differently from the rest. That worker's name, John Miller. Miller was summoned to the foreman's office. He walked in nervous, wiping his hands on his coveralls, expecting a reprimand. Instead, Knudsen himself was there, tall, silver-haired, with a voice like iron softened by respect. "You're the man who changed the turret fitting?" John hesitated. "Not on purpose, sir. I just thought it felt right." Knudsen nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's all innovation is, something feeling right." He didn't give speeches or medals that day. There wasn't time for ceremony. But he did order one thing, that every new worker in turret assembly be taught the Miller adjustment. It became part of the Chrysler Arsenal procedure, adopted not only in Detroit, but in Fisher Body and Pressed Steel Car Company plants across the country. Within months, every Sherman tank rolling off the line, in Detroit, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, bore the silent fingerprint of a man whose name would never appear in the blueprints. As 1943 turned to 1944, The impact was clear. In Italy, Allied tank units were reporting improved reliability under the harsh mountain terrain. In Normandy, the turrets that once jammed after long engagements now turned smooth even after hours of combat. Soldiers didn't know why, they just knew it worked. And when lives depend on machinery, that's all that mattered. Letters home from tank crews spoke of the difference. These new ones don't quit on us. Feels tighter, smoother, like someone finally fixed what was wrong. They didn't know it, but every word was a tribute to an unintentional act of brilliance. A wrench turn in a Detroit factory that made the machines of war more dependable. By late 1944, the arsenal of democracy was producing one tank every 25 minutes. Thousands of Shermans rolled from the line and onto ships bound for Europe and the Pacific. And in one corner of the massive plant, John Miller still worked quietly. Same uniform, same shift, same steady hands tightening the bolts that held the turret ring in place. But the torque wrench, his wrench, now bore a small brass tag, engraved by one of the plant foremen, Miller Spec, 200 feet LB. It wasn't official recognition, but for a man like John, it was enough. June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy roared with the sound of engines, gunfire, and waves crashing against steel. Thousands of Allied vehicles waited in line, jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks, their treads digging into the wet French sand. Among them, a column of them for Sherman tanks rumbled forward under gray skies. They were not the heaviest, nor the most armored, but they were there, ready, running, reliable. Every bolt in their turret rings held. Every rotation gear engaged cleanly. Every gun could swing to face the enemy, even after hours in mud and salt air. To the men inside, it meant life, and unknowingly, they owed that reliability to a decision made months earlier. A torque change on Line C, Detroit Arsenal Plant. The Shermans pushed inland. In places like Carentan, St. and Caen, the fighting turned brutal. German 88mm guns tore through Allied columns. Yet, the Shermans kept fighting, not because they were invincible, but because they were dependable. When a tank crew needed to traverse their gun to engage a hidden target, they didn't pray that the turret would move. It just did. Maintenance logs from the field recorded something remarkable. Breakdowns dropped by 12%. Turret malfunctions, once a recurring issue, fell almost to zero. The Army Ordnance Department called it a production improvement, but the engineers in Detroit knew better. Somewhere in their files, in the quiet language of internal memos, it reads simply, standardized torque calibration to Miller Spec. Back home, the arsenal of democracy ran day and night. The glow of molten steel painted the factory walls red. Welders' sparks filled the air like fireflies. And in the middle of it, John Miller still worked, never knowing that his adjustment had already crossed the Atlantic. To him, the war was distant thunder, reported by radio and newspaper headlines pinned on breakroom walls. Allies storm France, Nazis on the run. He didn't realize that somewhere on those beaches, American soldiers were surviving because their turrets moved just a fraction smoother, faster, steadier. Knudsen did. And when he walked the floor one evening, he stopped by Line C, watching the workers tighten bolts, clean fittings, calibrate torque wrenches to spec. This, he murmured, is how wars are won, not just on the front, but right here. By autumn 1944, Allied forces were pushing toward the German border. Shermans were everywhere, in forests, in towns, across muddy fields. The tank had become a symbol of American production, not perfect, but unrelenting. Every mechanical detail told the same story. Industrial learning turned into battlefield advantage. At Remagen, tanks rolled across the captured bridge faster than engineers believed possible. At Bastogne, during the bitter cold of the Ardennes, crews reported that turret systems didn't freeze as easily as before. The technical reports reached Washington, improved assembly precision contributing to increased operational readiness. A cold sentence of bureaucracy, but behind it, the proof that someone's intuition, once seen as a mistake, had quietly reshaped an army's efficiency. One evening, Miller's foreman handed him a letter stamped with the Chrysler seal. It wasn't from Knudsen or the War Department. It was from a captain serving with an armored division in France. It read, "To the men and women building our tanks back home, every time our turret moves, every time our engine starts, we think of you. You may never see what your hands have built, but we feel it every mile, every battle." John folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and went back to work. Same shift, same torque wrench, but maybe, just maybe, a little taller that night. Spring 1945. The war was ending. Berlin was in ruins. The echoes of gunfire faded across Europe, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that only comes after years of chaos. In that silence, America's factories began to slow. For the first time in half a decade, the constant hum of machinery started to fade. But the people who had built the arsenal of democracy, the welders, the riveters, the engineers, and the quiet night shift workers, still carried the rhythm of production in their veins. The war ends, but the work remains at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. Final production runs were winding down. Tanks were now being completed not for the front, but for storage, training, or sale to allies. Knudsen walked through the plant floor one last time, clipboard in hand. He watched the assembly lines that had once produced miracles, now still. The smell of hot metal replaced by the cool scent of oil and dust. He paused by line C. John Miller was there, as always, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've been here since the beginning," Knudsen said quietly. "You've done good work." John nodded. "Just did what needed doing, sir." Knudsen smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's exactly what changes history." Neither man said more. They didn't need to, because what they had built together, unknowingly, almost accidentally, had already shaped the outcome of the greatest conflict the world had ever known. When the war ended, the reports began to pour in from Normandy, Italy, the Ardennes, and the Pacific. Engineers compiled the lessons learned, improvements made, and production breakthroughs achieved. And buried deep in one of those reports, Underturret Assembly Adjustment Standardized, 1943, was a simple line. Improvement originated at Detroit Arsenal. Worker deviation resulted in mechanical optimization. It was cold, bureaucratic language. No names, no ceremony. But it was history, recorded forever. Miller never became famous. He went back to his small house on the east side of Detroit, his wife and 2 children waiting for him. The war had taken its toll, but it had also given him something he could never lose: quiet pride. A knowledge that somewhere, far away, his work had meant something. The industrial legacy in the years that followed, the lessons learned from wartime production, transformed America's factories. The concept of precision manufacturing, statistical control, and worker-driven innovation became the foundation of the modern American industry. By the 1950s, companies like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler began adopting systems that encouraged workers to report small process improvements, a practice that traced its roots back to the wartime assembly lines. Historians later called it the Miller effect, though the man himself never knew. It became a symbol of how the smallest insight, born from the hands of an ordinary worker, could ripple through an entire nation's progress. Knudsen, in his post-war memoirs, wrote a single line about it: "The strength of a factory is not in its machines, but in the minds of the people who run them." In every great war, heroes are remembered for their courage, on beaches, in skies, in trenches. But there is another kind of heroism, one forged not in battle, but in the endless repetition of labor. Turning wrenches, welding steel, tightening bolts. Men like John Miller never fired a gun, yet they armed a generation. They never stormed a beach, yet they made it possible for others to reach one. And while history rarely speaks their names, their fingerprints are on every victory. Decades later, in a museum outside Detroit, an M for Sherman tank sits quietly under dim lights. Its olive paint has faded. Its tracks are rusted. But its turret still turns, smooth, precise, unwavering. Visitors walk past it, reading plaques about production statistics and famous battles. None of them know about the torque wrench or the adjustment that changed everything. But if you stand close enough, you can almost hear it, the echo of the assembly line, the faint hum of machines, and the heartbeat of a nation built by hands like John Miller's. And maybe that's enough, because sometimes the greatest revolutions don't start in laboratories or boardrooms. They start with a single worker, a single decision, and the quiet belief that doing it right matters. Wars are fought by soldiers, but they are won by the people who build.